The crimson sun hung low over the rugged Arizona landscape when Kieran Kane first spotted her, a crumpled figure half hidden among the scrub brush. Her pale dress stained with dust and darker, more troubling marks. A woman, alone and clearly in distress, where no woman should be in this unforgiving stretch of desert in 1876. Kieran pulled back on the reins of his dun stallion, squinting against the harsh glare of the setting sun. At 32, he'd seen his fair share of hardship in these territories, but something about this particular scene made his blood run cold. The woman wasn't moving. "Easy, Thunder," he murmured to his horse, dismounting with practiced ease, his spurs jangling softly against the hard, packed earth. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached cautiously. These were dangerous times, and a man didn't survive long in the West without a healthy dose of suspicion. But as he drew closer, the sight before him drove all thoughts of danger from his mind. She was young, perhaps 25, with copper hair splayed across the dusty ground. Her face was marred with bruises, one eye swollen shut, dried blood crusting at the corner of her split lip. And unmistakably, beneath the simple calico dress stretched taut across her middle, the swell of advanced pregnancy. "Madam," Kieran called softly, crouching beside her, his calloused fingers seeking a pulse at her neck. Relief flooded through him at the faint but steady beat beneath his fingertips. "Madam, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing a glimpse of startling emerald green. A whimper escaped her lips as consciousness brought pain crashing back. "Don't try to move," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're hurt bad." "My baby," she whispered, her undamaged hand moving protectively to her swollen abdomen. "Please, my baby." Kieran nodded, though worry creased his weathered features. "I'll get you somewhere safe. You'll heal in my care, I promise you that." Fear flickered across her battered face. "He'll find me." "Who will, madam?" But her eyes had rolled back, consciousness fleeing once more. Kieran didn't waste another moment. With careful movements, he gathered her slight form into his arms, mindful of her pregnant belly and the bruises that mottled her pale skin. She weighed almost nothing, despite the child she carried. Thunder nickered softly as Kieran approached, the horse sensing something was amiss. "It's all right, boy," Kieran murmured. "We've got precious cargo now." Mounting with the injured woman was no easy task, but years of handling cattle and breaking horses had made Kieran strong and sure in his movements. He settled her across his lap, cradling her against his chest, and turned Thunder toward his homestead. Kieran's ranch lay 5 miles to the northwest, a modest spread he'd built with his own 2 hands after returning from the war. It wasn't much compared to some of the cattle baron's holdings, but it was his, free and clear. A place where he answered to no man. As Thunder carried them across the rugged landscape, Kieran found himself studying the woman's face. Even beneath the bruises and dried blood, he could see she was beautiful, delicate features, high cheekbones and full lips. Her hands were soft, not calloused like most frontier women's. She hadn't lived this hard life long. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time the silhouette of Kieran's cabin came into view. Simple but sturdy, the log structure stood as a testament to his determination to carve out a life here. Smoke curled from the chimney Mrs. Abernathy, the widow who came by twice weekly to cook and clean for him, must have started dinner before departing. Kieran dismounted carefully, still holding the unconscious woman, and carried her into the cabin. The main room was warm from the cook stove, the scent of beef stew hanging in the air. He laid her gently on his own bed in the small adjoining room, his mind racing with what needed to be done. First, water. He filled a basin from the pump and gathered clean cloths. Then, with gentle hands that belied his rugged appearance, he began cleaning the dirt and blood from her face. The bruises were worse than he'd initially thought. Someone had beaten her severely and deliberately. Anger rose in his chest like a physical thing, but he pushed it down. The woman and her unborn child needed care, not his rage. As he worked, she stirred again, her eyelids fluttering open. This time, panic immediately seized her. She tried to sit up, a cry of pain escaping her lips. "Easy," Kieran said, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here." "Where am I?" Her voice was raspy, her good eye darting around the sparse bedroom. "My ranch, about 20 miles east of Tucson. I found you out in the scrubland." He offered her a cup of water, which she took with trembling fingers. "I'm Kieran Kane." She drank deeply before speaking again. Abigail Turner." "Miss Turner, Mrs." she corrected quickly, then her face crumpled. "Though I suppose that no longer matters." Kieran nodded, not pressing for details. "Mrs. Turner, you're hurt bad and in your condition. I think we should fetch the doctor from town." Her hand shot out, gripping his forearm with surprising strength. No doctors. He'd find me." Fear made her voice quaver. "Please, I can't. He'll kill me this time." The implication was clear enough. Whoever had done this to her husband, Kieran presumed, would come looking. And she believed he would finish what he'd started. "All right," he conceded, though reluctantly. "No doctor for now, but you need rest and care. Your baby depends on it." At the mention of her child, Abigail's hand moved protectively to her belly. "How far along are you?" Kieran asked. 7 months, perhaps a little more." Her voice softened. "She still moves. I can feel her." Kieran nodded, relief evident in his features. "That's good. A fighter like her mother." A ghost of a smile touched Abigail's lips before fading. "You don't know me, Mr. Kane. Why would you help me?" It was a fair question. In these harsh territories, survival often meant minding one's own business. Strangers' troubles could quickly become your own, and most folks had enough hardship without inviting more. Kieran was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "My ma raised me to believe that what separates men from animals is what we do when we see suffering. I couldn't leave you out there." He paused. "And I've seen enough violence to last 10 lifetimes. I won't abide it against a woman and child." Abigail studied him with her one good eye, seeming to take the measure of him. Whatever she saw appeared to satisfy her, for she nodded slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I have nothing to offer in return." "I'm not looking for payment, Mrs. Turner." Kieran stood, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You should rest now. I'll bring you some stew when you wake." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him at the doorway. "My husband is Henry Turner. He owns the Silver Dollar Mine near Bisbee." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "If he finds me here, he'll kill us both." Kieran nodded, absorbing this information. The Silver Dollar was one of the richest strikes in the territory. Henry Turner was not a man without influence or resources. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Turner. You're safe tonight." As Kieran closed the bedroom door behind him, he wondered if he could keep that promise. One thing was certain: the simple life he'd carved out for himself had just become considerably more complicated. For 3 days, Abigail drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting to heal from the brutal beating. Kieran tended to her with a gentleness that surprised even himself, cleaning her wounds, helping her sip broth and water, and speaking in low, soothing tones when nightmares caused her to cry out. On the morning of the 4th day, he entered the bedroom to find her fully awake, propped against the pillows. The swelling around her eye had subsided enough that she could open it partially, and though the bruises remained, they had faded from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green. "Good morning," he said, setting down a tray with a bowl of porridge. "You're looking stronger today." "I feel it," she replied, her voice steadier than it had been. She glanced down at the simple nightshirt she wore, one of Kieran's, comically large on her frame despite her pregnant belly. "Did you?" Kieran felt heat rising in his cheeks. "Mrs. Abernathy helped with that. She's the widow lady who keeps house for me sometimes. She's been by to check on you, brought some of her old things for you to wear when you're ready." Relief washed over Abigail's face. "I'd like to thank her." "She'll be by tomorrow." He gestured to the porridge. "Think you can manage solid food today?" Abigail nodded, taking the spoon he offered. As she ate, Kieran found himself studying her again. With each passing day, as the evidence of violence receded, her natural beauty became more apparent. Her copper hair, now clean and brushed, fell in waves past her shoulders. Her eyes, both now visible, were indeed as green as he'd first thought the color of the river willows in spring. "Mr. Kane," she said suddenly, interrupting his thoughts, "I can't stay here indefinitely. I've imposed on your kindness too long already." "Where would you go?" he asked simply. The question hung in the air between them. Abigail set down her spoon, her appetite apparently gone. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no family left. Henry saw to that when we married, isolated me from everyone I knew. I was planning to reach California when he found me on the road. California's a long way for a woman in your condition to travel alone," Kieran observed. "I'm aware," she said, a flash of steel in her voice. "But I have little choice. When this child is born, I must be somewhere he can't find us." Kieran nodded slowly. "Mrs. Turner, I won't pretend to know what you've endured, but I do know something about running." He absently touched the faded blue kepi cap that hung on a peg near the door, the only reminder of his time in the Confederate cavalry. "Sometimes, running just postpones the inevitable." Anger sparked in Abigail's eyes. "Would you have me return to him then? After what he did to me, to our unborn child?" "No," Kieran said firmly. "I'd have you heal properly before making any decisions. The winter's coming on. The mountain passes to California will be treacherous soon, if not already. Stay here until spring, at least." Surprise registered on her face. "You would let me remain that long? This ranch has plenty of room for one more." "For two more," he corrected, glancing at her belly. "At least until you're strong enough to decide what's best for you and your child." Abigail studied him, wariness evident in her posture. "Why would you do this?" "You don't know me." It was a question Kieran had been asking himself these past days. Why had he brought this complication into his carefully ordered life? He'd spent years building walls around himself, keeping the world at arm's length. Yet something about this woman and her unborn child had breached those defenses without effort. "I know enough," he said finally. "I know you didn't deserve what was done to you. I know that child deserves a chance." He paused, then added more softly, "And I know what it's like to need shelter from a storm." A long moment passed between them, something unspoken shifting in the air. "Thank you," Abigail whispered, and this time Kieran didn't brush away her gratitude. "You're welcome, Mrs. Turner. Now finish your breakfast. You're eating for two." As autumn deepened, Abigail's strength returned gradually. Her bruises faded, though Kieran noticed she still carried herself carefully, as if expecting pain with each movement. The child within her grew more active, and sometimes he would catch her smiling softly, her hand resting on her swollen abdomen as she felt the baby move. Kieran had converted a small storage room into a bedroom for himself, insisting that Abigail keep the main bedroom. It was a tight fit for his large frame, but he'd slept in far worse conditions during the war. Mrs. Abernathy, a buxom widow of 50 with a heart as big as her booming laugh, had taken to visiting more frequently, bringing clothes she'd altered for Abigail and fussing over her delicate condition. To Kieran's surprise, Abigail proved herself determined not to be a burden. As soon as she could move about with reasonable comfort, she insisted on contributing to the household. Her cooking skills were limited evidently. The wife of a wealthy mine owner had servants for such tasks, but she learned quickly. Within weeks, she had taken over most of the indoor chores, freeing Kieran to focus on the ranch work that demanded his attention before winter set in. It was a peculiar arrangement, this domestic partnership between two virtual strangers. Yet somehow, they fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit by the fireplace, Kieran whittling or repairing tack, Abigail sewing baby clothes from fabric Mrs. Abernathy had brought. Sometimes they talked, more often they shared a comfortable silence. Bit by bit, Kieran learned her story. Abigail had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a moderately successful merchant. When her parents died of influenza within months of each other, leaving her with substantial debts and few prospects, she had accepted the proposal of Henry Turner, a man 20 years her senior, who had made his fortune in the Arizona silver mines. "I thought I was being practical," she confessed one evening, her hands busy with needlework. "I had no romantic notions about marriage. Henry offered security, respectability. I thought that would be enough." "When did he first hurt you?" Kieran asked, his voice carefully neutral. Abigail's hand stilled. 6 weeks after the wedding, I'd ordered new curtains for the parlor without consulting him first. A bitter smile crossed her lips. "He broke my wrist, told the doctor I'd fallen from a horse." Kieran's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, allowing her to continue. "After that it became routine. Any perceived slight, any minor defiance. He was always careful, though nothing visible when we had company." She touched her face unconsciously. "Until this." "What changed?" "I became pregnant," she said simply. He'd wanted an heir, of course, but when it happened, something shifted in him. He became convinced the child wasn't his, that I'd been unfaithful. Nothing I said made any difference. Kieran set down the bridle he'd been mending. "And you ran?" Abigail nodded. "I took money from his safe, enough for a stagecoach ticket to California and to start a new life. I made it as far as Tucson before he caught up with me." She swallowed hard. "He dragged me from the boarding house, beat me in the alley behind it, said he'd kill me and the bastard I carried. I thought he had, until I woke up alone in the desert. I can only assume he left me for dead." The firelight cast shadows across her face, highlighting the determination that had replaced fear in her eyes. This, Kieran realized, was the core of Abigail Turner, not the broken woman he'd found in the desert, but this resilient spirit who had endured and survived. "He won't find you here," Kieran said, the promise in his voice as solid as the mountains surrounding them. Abigail met his gaze across the small room, something unspoken passing between them. "I believe you," she said quietly, and returned to her sewing. As November yielded to December, the high country was transformed by the first heavy snowfall of the season. Kieran had spent the previous weeks preparing, chopping and stacking firewood, smoking meat, ensuring the root cellar was stocked with preserved vegetables and fruits. The ranch was as ready for winter as he could make it. Abigail's pregnancy had advanced to its final stages. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her back often paining her. Kieran found himself watching her with increasing concern, aware that the birth could come at any time, though Mrs. Abernathy had experience as a midwife. The isolation of the ranch during winter added an element of risk that weighed heavily on his mind. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Kieran returned from tending the stock to find Abigail standing at the window, her silhouette outlined against the glass. She had one hand pressed against the small of her back, the other resting on her enormous belly. "Everything all right?" he asked, stamping snow from his boots. She turned, and he was struck by the moonlit beauty of her face. The bruises had long since faded, revealing clear, pale skin flushed with the bloom of pregnancy. Her copper hair was braided loosely over one shoulder, and her green eyes held a serenity he hadn't seen before. "Yes," she said, smiling slightly. "She's restless tonight. Feel." Before he could protest, she had taken his hand and placed it against the swell of her abdomen. Kieran froze, uncertain, but then felt it a definite push against his palm, strong and insistent. "That's—" he began, then fell silent, momentarily overwhelmed by the miracle of it. "A foot, I think," Abigail laughed softly. "She's been doing somersaults all evening." Kieran should have withdrawn his hand immediately. It wasn't proper, this intimate contact, but he found himself mesmerized by the movement beneath his fingers. When he finally looked up, Abigail was watching him, something soft and unguarded in her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For this? For everything?" She gestured vaguely at the cabin around them. "For making me feel safe again." The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken feelings. Then the baby kicked again, breaking the spell, and Kieran stepped back, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their position. "I should check the firewood," he said gruffly, moving toward the door, but Abigail's voice stopped him. "Kieran." It was the first time she had used his given name. He turned, finding her still standing by the window, snowlight illuminating her profile. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Something important." He waited, sensing whatever she was about to say would change things between them. "If something happens to me when the baby comes, nothing's going to happen," he interrupted firmly. "But if it did," she persisted, "would you? Would you make sure my daughter is safe, that Henry never finds her?" The request hung in the air between them, weighty with implication. What she was asking was enormous for him to take responsibility for her child, to become its protector should the worst happen. Kieran should have hesitated, should have considered the ramifications. Instead, he found himself nodding. "Yes," he said. "I would guard her with my life, Abigail." "But it won't come to that." Relief washed over her features. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, with a small grimace, she added, "I think I need to lie down now. My back has been troubling me all day." Kieran was immediately concerned. "Do you think—" "No," she assured him. "Mrs. Abernathy says these pains are normal in the final weeks. The baby isn't due for another fortnight at least." He nodded, though worry lingered. "Call if you need anything." Abigail smiled and retreated to the bedroom, leaving Kieran alone with thoughts more complicated than he cared to examine. When had this woman and her unborn child become so important to him? When had the idea of them leaving come spring become so unthinkable? He moved to the fireplace, stirring the embers and adding another log. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the ranch in a cocoon of white silence. Inside, something equally transformative was happening, though Kieran wasn't quite ready to give it a name. Abigail's labor began 3 days later, in the cold, gray hours before dawn. Kieran woke to the sound of her cry, not loud, but unmistakably one of pain. He was on his feet instantly, pulling on trousers as he made his way to her bedroom door. "Abigail," he called softly, knocking. "Kieran," her voice was strained. I think it's time." He pushed open the door to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and damp with sweat, one hand clutching her belly. The bedsheets beneath her were wet. "My water broke an hour ago," she explained, wincing as another contraction seized her. "I thought it might be false labor, but—" "I'll fetch Mrs. Abernathy," Kieran said, already moving toward the door. "The snow," Abigail reminded him weakly. The storm that had begun days ago had intensified overnight, burying the surrounding countryside in deep drifts. "I'll manage," he assured her, though doubt gnawed at him. The widow's cabin was a good 3 miles away, across terrain that would be treacherous in these conditions. But there was no alternative. Kieran knew nothing about delivering babies. He dressed quickly, layering against the bitter cold. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised. "Try to rest between the pains." "Hurry," was all Abigail said, her eyes wide with a fear he hadn't seen since those first days after he'd found her. The journey to Mrs. Abernathy's cabin was every bit as difficult as Kieran had anticipated. Thunder struggled through snowdrifts that sometimes reached his chest, the bitter wind cutting through Kieran's layers like a knife. By the time he reached the widow's modest home, his face was numb and his fingers stiff with cold inside his gloves. Mrs. Abernathy, bless her practical soul, asked no questions when he pounded on her door. She simply packed her midwifery supplies, wrapped herself in every woolen garment she owned, and followed him into the storm. But the return journey was slower still, the wind having erased their tracks and dumped fresh snow in their path. By the time they reached the ranch, nearly 3 hours had passed since Kieran had left Abigail alone. The sound that greeted them as they entered the cabin turned his blood to ice, a keening moan of pain unlike anything he'd heard before. Mrs. Abernathy took charge immediately, shedding her outer layers as she bustled toward the bedroom. "Heat water," she instructed Kieran over her shoulder. "And bring clean linens, all you have." He did as told, grateful to have something useful to do. When he brought the requested items to the bedroom door, Mrs. Abernathy appeared, her normally cheerful face set in grave lines. "The baby's turned wrong," she said without preamble. "And she's been laboring too long without help. She's exhausted. Can you help her?" The older woman's hesitation was answer enough. "I'll do what I can, but I won't lie to you, Mr. Kane. It's not good." Fear, sharp and unfamiliar, lanced through Kieran's chest. "Save them," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "Whatever it takes, save them both." Mrs. Abernathy squeezed his arm once, then disappeared back into the bedroom, closing the door firmly behind her. What followed were the longest hours of Kieran Kane's life, worse than waiting for dawn on the eve of Shiloh, worse than the 3 days he'd spent trapped behind enemy lines near Vicksburg. At least in battle, a man could act, could fight. Here, he was powerless, relegated to pacing the small cabin while a woman he had come to care for more deeply than he'd realized fought for her life, and that of her child. The sounds from the bedroom tore at him, Abigail's cries, sometimes muffled as if she were biting down on something, sometimes raw and primal. Mrs. Abernathy's voice, alternately soothing and commanding. Once, the door opened long enough for the widow to request more hot water and fresh towels. The glimpse Kieran caught of Abigail, pale as death, her copper hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, haunted him as he resumed his pacing. Outside, the winter storm raged on, as if nature itself were reflecting the battle being waged within the cabin's walls. Kieran found himself doing something he hadn't done since he was a boy, praying. Not the formal prayers of church services, but desperate bargaining pleas. "Take me instead. Let them live. Please." It was nearly dusk when the quality of the sounds from the bedroom changed. A different kind of cry pierced the air, high-pitched, indignant, unmistakably new. Kieran froze mid-step, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then silence. The bedroom door opened slowly and Mrs. Abernathy emerged, her apron stained with blood, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. In her arms, wrapped in a clean towel, was a tiny, red-faced infant. "A daughter," she announced, a small smile breaking through her fatigue. Small but strong, lunged as you heard. Relief flooded through Kieran, so intense he had to brace himself against the table. "And Abigail." Something flickered in the widow's eyes. She lost a great deal of blood. I've done what I can to stop the bleeding, but—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Can I see her?" Mrs. Abernathy nodded, holding out the swaddled infant. "Here, take your daughter while I clean up a bit." Kieran didn't correct the assumption. He took the tiny bundle awkwardly, amazed at how little she weighed. The baby's face was scrunched and red, a wisp of copper hair just like her mother's visible beneath the edge of the towel. "Hello, little one," he whispered, and was startled when the infant's eyes opened, revealing unfocused but unmistakably blue eyes. Something shifted in his chest, a protective instinct so powerful it nearly took his breath away. He carried the baby with him as he entered the bedroom. The air was close and warm, heavy with the metallic scent of blood and something else, the sweet smell of new life. Abigail lay against the pillows, her face ashen, hair damp with sweat. For one terrible moment, Kieran thought they were too late, that she was already gone. Then her eyelids fluttered open. "Kieran," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My baby, she's here," he said, moving to the bedside so Abigail could see the infant in his arms. "She's perfect." A smile ghosted across Abigail's pale lips. "Let me hold her." Carefully, Kieran placed the newborn in her mother's weak arms. Abigail gazed down at her daughter with such love that Kieran felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. "She's beautiful," Abigail murmured. "Katherine, after my mother." "A fine name," Kieran agreed, his throat tight with emotion. Abigail looked up at him then, and something in her eyes made his heart stutter. "I'm not going to make it, am I?" "Don't talk like that," he said fiercely. "You'll be fine. You just need to rest." But they both knew it was a lie. The pallor of her skin, the weakness in her voice, the amount of blood that had soaked through the sheets despite Mrs. Abernathy's best efforts all pointed to a truth too terrible to acknowledge. "Kieran," Abigail said again, her voice suddenly urgent. "You promised. Remember. You promised to keep her safe." "And I will," he vowed, taking her cold hand in his. "But you're going to be there too, Abigail. You're going to watch her grow up. You're going to teach her all the things a mother should teach her daughter." She smiled faintly, but her eyes held a knowledge he couldn't bear to see. "I wish that were true, I wish." Her voice faltered. "What do you wish?" he asked, holding her hand tighter as if he could anchor her to this world through sheer force of will. "I wish we'd had more time," she whispered. "I wish I'd met you before everything. I think we could have been happy, you and I." The words pierced Kieran's heart with a pain more acute than any physical wound he'd ever suffered. Because she was right, they could have been happy. In the brief months they'd shared this small cabin, he'd come to admire her strength, her resilience, her quiet dignity. And somewhere along the way, admiration had deepened into something more profound, something he hadn't allowed himself to name until this moment, when it might be too late. "We still can be," he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. "You, me, and Katherine will be a family." The smile that touched Abigail's lips then was heartbreakingly beautiful. "I would have liked that," she murmured. Then her eyelids fluttered closed, her breathing becoming shallow. Kieran looked up in alarm to find Mrs. Abernathy standing in the doorway, her expression grave. She moved forward, gently taking the baby from Abigail's weakening arms. "Talk to her," the widow said softly. "Let her hear your voice. I'll tend to the little one." Left alone with Abigail, Kieran found himself at a loss. What could he say in the face of such imminent loss? What words could possibly matter now? In the end, he simply spoke from his heart. He told her about the life they could have had, the ranch expanding, prospering, Katherine growing strong and free in the Arizona sunshine. He described how he would have courted her properly, if things had been different, taken her to dances in town, brought her wildflowers in the spring. He confessed that he'd fallen in love with her courage first, then her kindness, and finally, with all of her smile, her determination, the way she hummed softly when she thought no one could hear. "I love you, Abigail," he said, the words both a beginning and an ending. "Rest now. Katherine and I will be waiting when you wake." But some part of him knew she wouldn't wake, not in this world. As the night deepened, her breathing grew more labored, each breath seeming to require more effort than the last. And then, just as the first gray light of dawn crept through the bedroom window, Abigail Turner took one final, shuddering breath and was still. Kieran sat beside her for a long time, holding her hand as it grew cold, memorizing the peaceful lines of her face in repose. Only the insistent cries of a hungry newborn finally drew him from her side. Mrs. Abernathy had prepared for this possibility. While Kieran had kept his vigil, she had ridden through the diminishing storm to the nearest neighbor with a nursing mother. The woman had provided goat's milk and instructions for feeding the infant with a cloth wick dipped in the milk. It wasn't ideal, but it would keep Katherine alive until a more permanent solution could be arranged. The days that followed passed in a blur for Kieran. There was the grave to dig, a task made more difficult by the frozen ground and the simple service, attended only by Mrs. Abernathy, her son who helped with the digging, and the infant Katherine, bundled against the bitter cold. There were practical matters to attend to, learning to feed and change the newborn, keeping the ranch functioning despite his exhaustion and grief. And throughout it all, there was the constant, gnawing awareness that Henry Turner was still out there somewhere. A man who had left his pregnant wife for dead in the desert would not hesitate to harm the child he believed wasn't his. Kieran's promise to Abigail weighed heavier with each passing day. It was Mrs. Abernathy who finally forced him to confront the situation. A week after Abigail's death, as she watched Kieran awkwardly changing Katherine's makeshift cloth diaper, she said bluntly, "You need to make a decision, Mr. Kane." He looked up, dark circles under his eyes, testament to the sleepless nights spent caring for a newborn while grieving her mother. "About what? About that child?" The widow gestured toward Katherine. "You can't keep her here indefinitely without raising questions. People will talk." Kieran's jaw tightened. "Let them talk." "It's not that simple, and you know it," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice gentler now. "That baby needs a mother, proper care. And if what Mrs. Turner told me about her husband is true, you'll be putting yourself in danger by keeping her." "I promised Abigail I'd protect her daughter," Kieran said firmly. "I won't break that promise. There are other ways to keep her safe, Mrs. Abernathy suggested. Good families in town who would take in an orphan, raise her as their own." The very thought made Kieran's chest tighten with a possessiveness that surprised him. In just a week, this tiny, red-faced bundle had become his world. Every time Katherine wrapped her tiny fingers around one of his, every time her unfocused blue eyes seemed to find his face, the bond between them strengthened. She might not be his by blood, but in every way that mattered, she was becoming his daughter. "No," he said with a finality that brooked no argument. "Katherine stays with me." Mrs. Abernathy studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but you'll need a story, and a good one. People will ask questions." She was right, of course. A single man with a newborn would raise eyebrows and invite scrutiny, the very thing that could lead Henry Turner to their doorstep. "What do you suggest?" Kieran asked, carefully wrapping Katherine in a fresh blanket. "The truth, or as near to it as is safe," the widow replied. "That you found a woman near death, that she delivered her baby and passed on, that you're caring for the child until relatives can be located." It was a plausible story, one that would explain Katherine's presence without inviting too many questions. But it didn't address the long-term problem: how to provide a proper home for a growing girl, how to protect her from a man who would see her dead. As if reading his thoughts, Mrs. Abernathy added softly, "And perhaps, when the time is right, you might consider remarrying. A child needs a mother's touch." The suggestion hit Kieran like a physical blow. The thought of another woman taking Abigail's place, even as Katherine's mother, felt like a betrayal of the feelings he'd only just begun to acknowledge before losing her. "That won't be necessary," he said stiffly, turning away to place Katherine in the makeshift cradle he'd constructed from a wooden crate. Mrs. Abernathy sighed but didn't press the issue. "Well, I'll continue to help as much as I can. But Mr. Kane, this won't be easy. Raising a child never is, even with two parents." Kieran knew she was right. The past week had been the most challenging of his life, the sleepless nights, the constant worry that he was doing something wrong, the grief that ambushed him at unexpected moments. But when he looked down at Katherine's sleeping face, so much like her mother's despite her newborn features, he knew there was no other choice he could make. "We'll manage," he said quietly, "one day at a time." Spring came to the Arizona high country, transforming the landscape with a brief but spectacular display of wildflowers before the heat of summer began to build. Katherine thrived despite her difficult entry into the world, growing from a fragile newborn into a chubby, alert infant with her mother's copper hair and what appeared to be her father's, Kieran's, blue eyes. Kieran had settled into the routines of single fatherhood with a determination that impressed even Mrs. Abernathy. He'd converted part of the main room into a nursery area, constructed a proper crib, and learned to perform ranch chores with Katherine strapped to his chest in a sling fashioned from one of Abigail's shawls. The arrangement wasn't ideal, but it worked. Katherine seemed content to observe the world from her perch against his heart, and Kieran found that the weight of her small body helped anchor him when grief threatened to pull him under. The story they'd concocted about Katherine's origins held up well enough. The few neighbors who visited accepted that Kieran had taken in an orphaned infant out of Christian charity, though he noticed the speculative glances some cast between him and the baby. Let them wonder, he thought. It didn't matter what people believed as long as Katherine was safe. As for Henry Turner, there had been no sign of the man. Occasionally, travelers passing through would bring news from Bisbee. The silver dollar mine was still producing well, and its owner was as ruthless in business as ever. But there was never any mention of a missing wife, no questions about a pregnant woman who had disappeared. It seemed that Turner had indeed believed Abigail dead and had no interest in finding her child. Still, Kieran remained vigilant. He never took Katherine to town, never mentioned her mother's true name to anyone besides Mrs. Abernathy. As far as the world was concerned, the baby was simply Kieran Kane, an orphan he'd taken in. He told himself that this caution was purely about keeping his promise to Abigail, protecting her daughter at all costs. But in the quiet hours of the night, as he rocked Katherine to sleep, he had to admit that there was more to it. The thought of losing her, this child who had become the center of his world, was unbearable. It was on a sweltering August afternoon, as Kieran was repairing a fence line with Katherine dozing against his chest, that he first noticed the dust cloud in the distance. Visitors were rare this far from town, especially in the heat of summer. He straightened, shielding his eyes against the glare, trying to make out how many riders approached. Just one, he decided after a moment. A single horse and rider, moving steadily toward the ranch house. Probably a traveler seeking water or directions. Still, caution made him reach down to ensure his revolver was accessible at his hip. Katherine stirred against him, making the small, contented sounds that indicated she was waking from her nap. Kieran patted her back gently, his eyes still fixed on the approaching rider. "Looks like we have company, little one," he murmured. "Let's go see who it is." He gathered his tools and headed back toward the cabin, timing his pace so that he would reach it just as the visitor arrived. No sense in appearing unwelcoming, but neither did he want to be caught out in the open if the stranger proved unfriendly. As the rider drew closer, Kieran could see it was a woman unusual for these parts, where travel was still dangerous enough that most women wouldn't risk journeying alone. She was dressed practically in a riding skirt and jacket, her face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Something about her posture in the saddle struck him as familiar, though he couldn't place it. It wasn't until she reined in her horse in the yard before the cabin, raising her head so that sunlight illuminated her features, that recognition hit him like a physical blow. The eyes that met his were Abigail's eyes, the same clear emerald green, the same direct gaze. But the face that housed them belonged to a woman perhaps 10 years older, with lines of hardship etched around her mouth and streaks of gray in her dark copper hair. "Kieran Kane?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of the Eastern refinement that had marked Abigail's speech. "Yes," he replied cautiously, one hand instinctively moving to cradle Katherine's head protectively. "And who might you be?" The woman's gaze dropped to the infant strapped to his chest, and something like pain flashed across her features. "My name is Amanda Thornton. I believe you've been caring for my niece." For a moment, Kieran couldn't speak. Abigail had told him she had no family left, that her husband had isolated her from everyone she'd known. Yet here was a woman claiming to be her aunt, a woman with Abigail's eyes and coloring. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, his voice harder than he'd intended. Katherine, sensing his tension, began to fuss. Amanda Thornton dismounted with the ease of someone accustomed to riding. Up close, the resemblance to Abigail was even more striking. "Mr. Kane, I understand your caution," she said, keeping a respectful distance. "But I assure you I mean no harm to you or the child. I'm Abigail's mother's sister. I've been searching for her for over a year." Kieran's mind raced. If this woman truly was Abigail's aunt, she might have a legal claim to Katherine. The thought made his blood run cold. "Abigail told me she had no family," he said, still wary. A shadow crossed Amanda's face. "Henry Turner told her we had abandoned her. In truth, he prevented any communication between us. It wasn't until a former servant of theirs managed to get word to me about Abigail's pregnancy and her situation that I even knew where to look for her. It was plausible enough." Kieran had seen firsthand the results of Turner's cruelty and controlling nature. Still, he wasn't about to hand Katherine over to a stranger on the strength of a claimed family connection and a physical resemblance. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm not sure what you've heard, but I know my niece is dead, Mr. Kane," she interrupted gently. "The woman in town, Mrs. Abernathy, I believe told me when I inquired after you. She also told me how you found Abigail, how you cared for her in her final days, and how you've been raising her child as your own." Her voice softened. "I'm not here to take the baby from you. I simply wanted to see her, to know that she's well. She's the only family I have left." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Still, Kieran hesitated. "Would you like to come inside? It's too hot to stand out here, especially for the little one." Relief washed over Amanda's face. "Yes, thank you." Inside the cabin, Kieran busied himself making coffee while Amanda Thornton sat at the table, her eyes never leaving Katherine. He had removed the sling, and the baby now sat contentedly on a blanket on the floor, batting at a wooden rattle. "She has Abigail's hair," Amanda observed softly. "And her chin." "Yes," Kieran agreed, setting a cup of coffee before her, "but I think her eyes will stay blue." Like her father's, perhaps, Amanda said, then clarified quickly when she saw Kieran's expression harden. I mean her biological father, not Henry Turner. Kieran's head snapped up. What do you mean? Amanda sipped her coffee before answering. Abigail wrote to me in secret shortly before she fled. She managed to smuggle the letter out with that same servant I mentioned. In it, she confessed that the child she carried wasn't Henry's. That's not possible, Kieran said, frowning. Abigail never mentioned. Would she have? Amanda asked gently. A proper Boston-raised girl admitting to adultery, even in her desperate circumstances, some things are difficult to confess. Kieran's mind reeled. If the baby wasn't Turner's, it would explain the man's rage, his certainty that Abigail had been unfaithful. But it also raised questions that made him deeply uncomfortable. Did she say who the father was? Amanda shook her head. Only that he was a kind man, someone who worked for them briefly. I got the impression it was a brief connection, born of her desperation to escape a brutal marriage. She paused, studying Kieran's face. Does it matter, did it? Kieran looked at Katherine, contentedly gumming her rattle, unaware of the adult's conversation about her origins. He had loved this child from the moment he first held her, had promised her dying mother to protect her always. The identity of the man who had contributed to her creation seemed irrelevant in the face of that bond. No, he said finally. It doesn't matter at all. Amanda nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. Good, because what matters now is keeping her safe. Henry Turner is still looking for Abigail's child. Kieran tensed. How do you know this? Because he came to Boston, to my home, demanding to know where Abigail had gone, Amanda replied, her voice tight with remembered fear. He was convinced I was hiding them. When I truthfully told him I didn't know where she was, he made it clear that if he found them, neither would survive. The threat, even secondhand, made Kieran's protective instincts flare. He'll never touch her, he said with quiet intensity. I swore that to her mother. I believe you, Mr. Kane, Amanda said. But the fact remains, as long as Henry Turner lives and believes the child might exist, Katherine is in danger. And he has resources, men who will search on his behalf, officials he can bribe. Kieran had considered this, of course, during the long nights of Katherine's early infancy. But hearing it confirmed by someone who knew Turner personally made the threat seem more immediate. What do you suggest? He asked, watching as Katherine abandoned her rattle and began trying to pull herself up using a nearby chair leg. Amanda hesitated before speaking. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Kane. One that might benefit us both and, most importantly, protect Katherine. I'm listening. Marry me, she said simply. Kieran stared at her, certain he had misheard. I beg your pardon, marry me, Amanda repeated. It would give Katherine the appearance of a normal family mother-father, both caring for her. It would strengthen your claim to her if questions ever arise, and it would allow me to be part of my niece's life, to honor my sister's memory by helping to raise her child. It was such an unexpected suggestion that Kieran found himself momentarily speechless. Marriage, to this woman he had just met. The very idea seemed absurd, yet as he considered it, he had to admit there was a certain practical logic to the proposal. Katherine did need a mother figure in her life. Having a legal wife would indeed strengthen his claim to the child if anyone ever questioned it. And if Amanda truly was Abigail's aunt, she had as much right to love and care for Katherine as he did. But marriage was supposed to be more than a practical arrangement. Wasn't it, Mrs. Thornton? He began carefully. I appreciate your concern for Katherine, and I can see the practical advantages of what you're suggesting, but marriage is sacred, she supplied with a small, sad smile. Yes, ideally it is, but I'm not proposing a romantic union, Mr. Kane. I'm too old for such notions, and I suspect your heart is still with my niece." When he didn't deny it, she continued, "What I'm suggesting is a partnership, a joining of resources to protect and raise this child we both love. Nothing more, nothing less." Put that way, it didn't sound so outlandish. Still, Kieran hesitated. "I don't know you," he said finally. "And you don't know me. How can we be sure we could live together, raise a child together?" "We can't be sure," Amanda acknowledged. "But I know what kind of man takes in a beaten pregnant woman and promises to care for her child. And you know that I've traveled across the country to find the last connection to my family. Perhaps that's enough to build on." Katherine chose that moment to lose her grip on the chair leg and sit down hard on her bottom. Her face crumpled in surprise and disappointment, and before Kieran could move, Amanda was there, lifting the baby into her arms with practiced ease. "There now, little one," she murmured, bouncing Katherine gently. "You'll master standing soon enough." The baby, who was typically wary of strangers, regarded this new person with curious eyes before breaking into a gummy smile. Something about the sight Katherine's copper curls against Amanda's shoulder, the woman's gentle handling of the infant created a lump in Kieran's throat. "Think about it," Amanda said, catching his eye over Katherine's head. "That's all I ask. I'll be staying in town for a few days. Whatever you decide, I'd like to visit her again before I leave." Kieran nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." And think about it he did, long after Amanda Thornton had ridden back toward town. He thought about it as he fed Katherine her dinner of mashed vegetables, as he bathed her in the metal tub on the kitchen floor, as he rocked her to sleep while humming the lullaby he'd heard Abigail sing during her pregnancy. He thought about Abigail, about the love that had bloomed between them too late, about his promise to keep her daughter safe at any cost. Would she approve of this arrangement? Would she want her aunt to help raise her child? He thought about Katherine's future, a girl growing up without a mother's guidance, in a household where visitors were rare and female influence limited to Mrs. Abernathy's occasional presence. Was that fair to her? And he thought about himself, about the loneliness that had begun to creep back in despite Katherine's presence, about the long years stretching ahead. Could he find contentment in a marriage of convenience, a partnership based on shared responsibility rather than love? By dawn, he had made his decision. He dressed Katherine in her best gown, a tiny confection of white cotton that Mrs. Abernathy had sewn, and rode into town, the baby secure in her sling against his chest. Amanda Thornton was staying at the town's only hotel, a modest two-story building that catered primarily to travelers passing through on their way to more prosperous settlements. Kieran found her taking breakfast in the small dining room, her expression registering surprise and then pleasure at the sight of Katherine. "Mr. Kane," she greeted him, rising from her table. "And little Katherine, what a lovely surprise, Mrs. Thornton," he acknowledged, suddenly uncertain now that the moment had arrived. "Might we speak privately?" she nodded, gesturing toward the hotel's small parlor currently unoccupied. Once they were seated, Katherine contentedly exploring the watch chain that hung from Kieran's vest pocket, he cleared his throat. "I've been considering your proposal," he began. "And?" Amanda prompted when he fell silent. "I have conditions," Kieran said, his voice firmer now. "First, Katherine stays with me always. If for any reason our arrangement doesn't work out, she remains in my custody." Amanda nodded. "Agreed. What else?" "Second, we're honest with her when she's old enough to understand, about Abigail, about how we came to be a family." "Of course," Amanda said. "I would never want to hide her mother's memory from her." Kieran took a deep breath. "And third, this would be a real marriage legally and in the eyes of the community, but privately we would be partners, not husband and wife in the traditional sense." He felt heat rising in his face at having to specify such a thing, but it seemed important to be clear. Amanda's expression was unreadable for a moment, then she nodded. "I understand and accept your terms. Do you have any others?" He shook his head. "Then you're agreeing to the arrangement." "Yes," Kieran said, looking down at Katherine, who had abandoned the watch chain and was now attempting to stuff her fist into her mouth. "For her sake, yes." Something that might have been relief washed over Amanda's features. "Thank you," she said softly. "I promise you won't regret this decision. When would you want to?" Kieran trailed off, unsure how to phrase it. "As soon as possible," Amanda replied practically. "There's a justice of the peace in town, is there not? We could speak to him today, have the ceremony tomorrow or the next day. The sooner we establish ourselves as a family unit, the better for Katherine's security." It was happening so quickly. Kieran had expected some time to adjust to the idea, perhaps a period of courtship for appearance's sake. But Amanda's urgency made sense from a practical standpoint. And really, what would be gained by delay? "Very well," he agreed. "I'll speak to Justice Wilson this morning." 2 days later, in a brief ceremony witnessed only by Mrs. Abernathy and the hotel proprietor, Kieran Kane married Amanda Thornton. The bride wore a simple blue dress, the groom his best shirt and a freshly trimmed beard. Katherine, held by Mrs. Abernathy during the exchange of vows, seemed unimpressed by the proceedings, more interested in chewing on the ribbon of her bonnet. There was no celebration afterward, no wedding supper or dance. Amanda simply gathered her few belongings from the hotel, and Kieran drove them both back to the ranch in his wagon, Katherine sleeping peacefully in her new aunt-turned-stepmother's arms. As they approached the cabin, Kieran was struck by how unchanged it looked, despite the momentous shift in his circumstances. The same weathered logs, the same curl of smoke from the chimney where he'd left a fire banked that morning. Yet everything was different now. He was no longer a man alone, raising an orphaned infant against all odds. He was a husband, part of a family unit, however unconventionally formed. "It's lovely," Amanda said as he helped her down from the wagon. "Just as Abigail described it in her letter." The mention of Abigail sent a pang through Kieran's chest. "She wrote to you about the ranch," Amanda nodded, shifting Katherine in her arms as the baby began to wake. "She said it was the first place she had felt truly safe in years, that you had created a home here, not just a house." The simple observation, relayed from beyond the grave, brought a lump to Kieran's throat. "I tried to make it comfortable for her," he said gruffly, turning away to unload Amanda's trunk. Inside, he showed Amanda around the modest cabin, the main room with its fireplace and table, the small bedroom that had been Abigail's and was now to be Amanda's, the storage room he had converted for himself, and the corner of the main room that served as Katherine's nursery area. "It's not much," he apologized, suddenly seeing the place through a stranger's eyes, the rough-hewn furniture, the simple furnishings, the lack of the refinements a Boston-raised lady might expect. "It's perfect," Amanda said, and something in her voice made him believe she meant it. A true home. They settled into a routine more easily than Kieran had expected. Amanda proved to be practical and industrious, taking over much of Katherine's care while also assuming the household duties Kieran had been managing alone. She was a better cook than he was, and under her supervision, the cabin became more organized and comfortable without losing its essential character. For his part, Kieran found himself with more time and energy to devote to the ranch. The summer's work mending fences, tending the small herd of cattle, preparing for the fall roundup progressed more efficiently now that he wasn't constantly dividing his attention between ranch chores and infant care. They were partners, as agreed, sharing responsibilities, consulting each other on decisions regarding Katherine, presenting a united front to the occasional visitor. In public, they maintained the appearance of a normal married couple, though privately they kept to their separate rooms and separate lives. It was an arrangement that worked, for the most part. Katherine thrived under their combined care, growing from a baby into a toddler with remarkable speed. She learned to walk, holding onto Amanda's fingers, and her first clear word was a joyful "pa," directed at Kieran when he returned from a day's work on the range. The danger from Henry Turner seemed remote as the months passed with no sign that he had tracked them to this isolated corner of the territory. Still, they remained vigilant. Amanda never took Katherine into town, and they agreed on a story about their marriage and the child's origins that contained enough truth to be believable without revealing Abigail's connection to either of them. It was a functional arrangement, a successful partnership. But as the first anniversary of their unusual marriage approached, Kieran found himself increasingly aware of the distance they maintained, the careful boundaries neither crossed. He would watch Amanda reading to Katherine by the fire, or hanging laundry in the yard with the toddler helping at her skirts, and feel a strange emptiness he couldn't quite name. One evening, after Katherine had been put to bed in her crib, now moved into Amanda's room, Kieran found himself sitting across the table from his wife as she mended one of his shirts. The domesticity of the scene struck him suddenly. How normal it would appear to an outsider, how unlike the reality of their relationship. "Are you happy here, Amanda?" he asked abruptly, surprising himself with the question. She looked up from her sewing, her needle paused mid-stitch. "What makes you ask that?" Kieran shrugged, uncomfortable now that he'd raised the subject. "You've given up a lot, your home in Boston, your independence, all to help raise a child who isn't yours by blood." "Katherine is my family," Amanda said simply. "And yes, I am happy here. Happier than I've been in many years, actually." She studied his face. "Are you not happy with our arrangement?" "It's not that," he said quickly. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if there could be more between us than a practical partnership." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Amanda set down her sewing, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Kieran," she said finally, her voice gentle, "when we made this agreement, you were still in love with my niece. Has that changed, had it?" Kieran considered the question honestly. The sharp pain of losing Abigail had dulled over time, though he still visited her grave on the hillside behind the cabin, still spoke to her sometimes when he was alone. But the desperate, all-consuming grief had eased, making room for something else, a growing appreciation for the woman who had become his partner in raising Abigail's child. "I'll always care for Abigail," he said slowly. "She gave me Katherine, and for a brief time she showed me what it meant to truly connect with another person after years of keeping the world at arm's length." He met Amanda's gaze directly. "But yes, it has changed. Or rather, new feelings have grown alongside the old ones." Amanda was quiet for a long moment, and Kieran began to regret his candor. Then she said softly, "I came here for Katherine. That was my only thought, to find Abigail's child, to be part of her life, to honor my sister's memory through her daughter. I never expected to find—" She hesitated. "To find a man like you, Kieran. Someone honorable, kind, devoted to a child not his own, someone I could come to care for deeply." Hope, unexpected and fragile, bloomed in Kieran's chest. "Amanda, are you saying?" She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I'm saying that perhaps there could indeed be more between us than a practical arrangement, if that's what you truly want." Kieran reached across the table, taking her hand in his. It was the first time he had touched her with intent, not just the accidental contact of two people sharing a home and a child. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The way a man should court the woman he admires, the way I never had the chance to court Abigail." Amanda's fingers tightened around his. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. And so began a curious courtship between two people already married, already sharing a home and a child, yet still discovering each other as individuals rather than partners in a practical arrangement. Kieran brought Amanda wildflowers when he returned from working the range, took her on picnics by the stream that cut through their property, read poetry aloud in the evenings after Katherine was asleep. Amanda, in turn, revealed more of herself, her love of music, her dry wit, her passion for education that had made her something of an anomaly in Boston society. She played the small piano Kieran purchased and transported from Tucson at considerable expense, filling the cabin with melodies that made Katherine clap her hands in delight. Their first kiss happened on a summer evening much like the one when Kieran had first broached the subject of changing their relationship. They stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold, Katherine already asleep inside. "It's so beautiful here," Amanda said softly. "I understand now why Abigail felt at peace in this place." Kieran glanced at her profile, gilded by the fading light. "She would be happy, I think, seeing Katherine grow up, loved seeing you here with us." Amanda turned to face him, her eyes, so like Abigail's, filled with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to hope for. "And us? Would she be happy about that too?" "Yes," Kieran said with a certainty that surprised him. "She would want us both to find happiness, however unexpected the path." When he kissed her, it was gentle, questioning a beginning rather than a culmination. Amanda's hand came up to rest against his cheek, and when they parted, her smile held a promise of things to come. That night, for the first time, they shared a bed not as strangers bound by a practical arrangement, but as a man and woman choosing to build something genuine from an unconventional beginning. In the soft light of dawn, with Amanda sleeping peacefully beside him, Kieran reflected on the strange, winding path that had led him here. From a solitary existence to finding a beaten, pregnant woman in the desert. From loss and grief to an unexpected second chance at love and family. He thought of Abigail, of the brief, precious time they'd shared, of the child who carried her copper hair and determined spirit. There would always be a place in his heart for her, a quiet corner where he honored what might have been. But as Amanda stirred beside him, as Katherine's morning babble came through the thin wall separating their rooms, Kieran knew with absolute certainty that this was where he belonged. This improbable family, formed through tragedy and chance and choice, was his home now. Later that morning, they took Katherine to visit her mother's grave. The toddler didn't understand, of course, but she seemed to sense the importance of the moment, staying unusually still in Amanda's arms as Kieran placed wildflowers on the simple wooden cross. "Thank you," he whispered to the woman who had given him both grief and joy, loss and renewal, "for trusting me with her, for leading me here." Amanda's free hand found his, their fingers intertwining as they stood together in the dappled sunlight, three lives connected by the memory of a fourth. Not the family any of them had expected, perhaps, but a family nonetheless bound by love, strengthened by adversity, facing the future together. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, a reminder that danger might still lurk on the horizon. Henry Turner was still out there somewhere, still a potential threat to the peace they had found. But Kieran wasn't afraid. Whatever came, they would face it together. Katherine, growing restless, pointed at a butterfly dancing among the wildflowers on Abigail's grave. "Pretty," she declared, one of her few clear words. "Yes, little one," Amanda agreed, tears glinting in her eyes. "Very pretty. like your mama was." As they walked back to the cabin, Katherine now insisting on toddling between them, holding their hands, Kieran thought about the promise he had made to a dying woman in the depths of winter. "You'll heal in my care," he had told Abigail when he found her beaten and alone in the desert. He hadn't been able to save her, but her daughter was thriving, growing strong in the home he'd created. And perhaps, in a way he hadn't anticipated, he and Amanda had begun to heal each other, two wounded souls finding connection through their love for a child. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected. But as Katherine's laughter rang out across the sun-drenched yard, as Amanda's hand found his again, Kieran Kane knew it was an ending and a beginning that would have made Abigail smile.